Your Worship, we are now live streaming. Over to you. Thank you.
Can you hear me? That's very good. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this really interesting 3 or 4 hour session that we've got, Housing and Social Needs Assessment Workshop, and then we'll be going on to the housing strategy. I particularly want to welcome the Mana Whenua representatives here, because this is the first time we're having an insight really into your own assessment of your housing needs and what well-being means. It's not just about building houses, it's about well-being associated with that. So welcome, and I'll ask Natasha to introduce that. But before then, apologies from Councillor Randall, who's not able to come. I have no other apologies to add to that. So Natasha.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Your Worship. Welcome to this session on the Housing and Social Needs Assessment. This has been a significant piece of work that's been undertaken for some months now. And the purpose of this work is to position us to understand and be able to respond to housing issues that we're facing in Kapiti. Again, just reiterating that welcome to iwi partners. Their support and assistance with this work has been a really important part of it. We do have a host of people here who have been involved in this work, and I'll introduce them to you shortly. And then I will hand over to Steve Flood, who's going to provide a little bit of an introduction. His drive behind this work has been instrumental in getting it to where it is now. So the support that we've got here for you, we've got Dr. Natalie Allen and Hattie Young, both from the Urban Advisory. They've been driving most of the work on the qualitative assessment, so that includes the focus groups and the community survey, and a lot of the work with iwi. We've got Chris Gladell from Community Housing Aotearoa and Ian Mitchell, who've done a lot of the quantitative work, trawling through Stats NZ data, IDI data, and getting a whole bunch of the number crunching done for us. And in terms of our iwi partners here, we have with us today, we have Carl Farrell from Ngāti Haumia, Kirsten and Denise Hapata from Ngāhapu Otaki, and Helmut Mudlik from Ngāti Toa was also joining us. I'm not quite sure if he is if he's here yet. If he's not, hopefully he will be able to join us shortly. So with that, I will hand over to Steve, who's going to introduce this piece of work.
Before that, can I just interrupt to say that at some point when Natalie Allen, I've asked her to manage the questions, because she'll be the traffic warden, to be able to direct questions to the number of subject experts that have been working on this paper. So, okay, Steve.
Kia ora and good morning. I'm going to keep my bit pretty short because we've got a lot to get through today, but there's a few things that I want to say. I think the first is that this is the first time in New Zealand that this sort of report has been done in this depth. I worked on a similar report in Porirua about 5 years ago, but we've really taken this to the next step. And a key bit of this work was to have iwi involved right from the very start of this process. So I just want to acknowledge and thank them for all of their input. I think most of them are probably sick of hearing from me because I'm pretty persistent and just really wanting to make sure that they had an opportunity to be involved in whatever way that they wanted to be involved. And each iwi has taken their own approach to this. So you'll see as we go through the presentation that you'll see a different approach from each iwi. I also want to thank all of the organisations and people that I talked to. So it was a pretty intense 6 or 8 weeks. I think I did about 45 focus groups. We talked to young people, old people, property brokers, government agencies, you name it, we talked to everybody. And I have to say, even though I've been involved in this work for a long time, it was pretty hard work listening to a lot of those stories. People with multiple needs right across the housing continuum. So it wasn't just people that are living in social housing or emergency housing. It was people that was working It was people that were retired. It was people that owned houses that were worth a significant amount of money. It was people that were renting. And through those conversations, we heard about how it was impacting on people's schooling, on people's health and well-being, and having to make some choices about whether to go to the doctors, whether to buy food that week or go to the food bank. Very strong conversations about lack of or loss of connection to place and connection to family and services. That came through across the whole district. I talked to most of the big government agencies. They're all struggling. They're all looking for housing for people that they're supporting, and then they're competing with people that are just looking for housing in Kapiti. Lots of stories about people in emergency accommodation and really being trapped there because there was no alternative for them. So there was one in particular that stood out for me, which was a family of 5 in a 1-bedroom motel unit with a child with ADHD, and just no end in sight for them at all. Yeah, how could a family be expected to live in a motel unit with limited cooking and kitchen facilities and no place for the children to play? So it's easy to get caught up in the size of this issue, but I reflect on a conversation I had with James Tapuni from Ngāti Tools community housing provider a few months ago. And he was saying, even if we find one more house, that's one family that don't have to experience living in emergency accommodation for any longer than they have to. There are lots of examples, but I won't talk about those because they'll come through as Natalie goes through the presentation today. But there's definitely a willingness for change. You know, people want to be involved in what housing options there could be for them in Kapiti, and wanting that housing to be in the right place. So it needs to be close to services and transport. You know, we're growing rapidly, and I suppose if I want to say anything, it's just about council is one part in the cog of the solution. We need to work together with all those iwi partners and government agencies and community housing providers and others to intentionally think about how we can support people to remain living in Kapiti. I'm going to be here for the whole session today. So again, when we get to questions and answers, you can answer, or you can direct any questions directly to me. But again, to everybody that took part, including the Urban Advisory and Chris and Ian, thank you for your support, because it's been a mammoth piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Natalie will lead most of the presentation shortly. It is a long session, so we will have a break part way through, which Natalie will signal at the appropriate time. So with that, I'll hand over to Natalie, and at the end of this, we'll talk about the next steps as well.
Great, kia ora koutou. Ke te mihi mi hari koa ahau ki konei. Thank you so much for having me here. I hope my enthusiasm for being able to draw these stories together into this housing needs assessment really translates through the screen today. I know it's a shame we can't all be together, but I'm sure there will be many opportunities to talk more about this as action starts from this, essentially. So today, I thought it would be most useful if I started with a presentation to really give you a good run through of the process and all the different parts of this assessment and how it came together. And so if possible, we're going to keep the questions until afterwards. Because we've got all our fantastic, or a number of our fantastic iwi partners here, I thought it would be really great to have some question time with them once I finish. And probably after that point is when it will be a great time for us to take a quick break, get a cup of tea, and then when we come back, it will be just question and answers. We thought it was really important that you all had a chance to ask questions and to hear more from us. Obviously, I can't condense the entire report into this presentation, but I will give you a good overview, but we can use that question time to go into a bit more depth on the critical topics for you all. So really, the way that this project has been framed is that it was about, not just a house, a life, and it drew in all those extra aspects that actually make living in a community contribute to your overall well-being. So one of the key, thoughts behind this work is that there's so many more people coming to Kapiti, and there'll be all these additional dwellings are needed, 15,000 plus is the estimation we have. And it's about really trying to unpack what this actually means for the future of our Kapiti communities and what is really at the heart of housing issues today. So just quickly, what is a housing needs assessment? It's a process to understand what will help people thrive in their communities and what makes the right type of house a home. And why we've done one in Kapiti, in light of the fact that we already know that there's a problem. There are obviously a number of people working on it from different areas, but this data is really about helping us to illustrate the extent of the issues, to understand not only that sort of quantitative data, but also bring in people's stories and understand who might be being missed by that data and how we actually need to support them. So it's a very kind of whole system approach, and that's really about giving us an evidence base to help decide how to prioritize our response going forward. So the process and what we did, as Steve has already mentioned, we had fantastic engagement from iwi, identifying how they wanted to run their own processes, which fed in to the whole process. There was the quantitative data assessment piece by Ian and Chris, who will also talk today in question time. They'll be available. Then we had the community korero events or focus groups. So over 160 kind of participants spending a lot of time sharing their stories, and absolutely thank them for being involved. And also the community survey, where we had over 1,300 responses, which is a great number. And on top of that, we also did a business survey to kind of target that key sector as well, and had over 100 responses to that. So all these kind of pieces of work have come together in this needs assessment, and really the next steps, which will also be picked up on in more detail in the session after this one with Natasha about the housing strategy. And that's looking at council's role in part, but also the shared solutions that we need to work towards. So just, quickly, and there may be many community members listening or watching this as well, a huge thank you from the whole team. E mihi nui ana ki ngā tangata o Kapiti I kōrero mai rai o roto whakaro mō ngā whare I roto tēnei mahi, because this work would not be possible without your contribution, and we're deeply grateful. So I'd just like to begin by giving kind of a high-level overview of the iwi needs assessment, conscious that that it will be much better, obviously, coming from those representatives, but they have very kindly, agreed that I can share this with you now. And so, essentially, what was important about this is that each iwi group could decide how they wanted to participate and be involved, what information they wanted to share and what information they kind of needed from council. And while we've got this portion kind of summarised in the report that will be available for everyone, I think it's also important to note that those processes will also be captured in other ways and used by each of the groups involved. And it's also a very ongoing process. So it's not about just getting inputs for this, it's really about continuing to build that relationship and work together over time. So this is just the beginning. And this section is really at the moment an excerpt from the draft final report. Not all my slides will be that way, but I just wanted to give everyone a sense of how things were kind of coming together and being captured. So ngā hapo o Taki, it was fantastic working with Kim, with Kirsten, and with Denise, 3 fantastic wahine toa who put together their own kāinga survey, which had just over 100 responses. And they also had some local hui that whānau could participate in to again share that depth of story. And that was really about, you know, capturing the extent of the issues, but also really hearing from whānau about what a whānau first response could look like, and really understanding kind of the nitty-gritty of people's situations, which is fantastic to have, because it can be leveraged off in so many ways when developing these partnerships and looking for projects, and also looking to work across agencies with government to help catalyse some of the solutions. One key message is that, you know, because of all the rising living costs, there is this, you know, displacement that's starting to happen, and we're at a critical point in needing to address that. And so a key message here is that the time is now to really focus on addressing that. And a little less than half of those that responded don't feel they have secure housing, which is obviously critical. And fundamental to that sense of, you know, security and belonging was being able to live close to their marae, to be able to preserve and really live every day within their, you know, community culture and that significant Te Māori way of life. So just some kind of key findings that we thought could be interesting was that 2 out of 3 of the respondents to the survey had interest in Māori land in the area and would like to build papa kāinga or housing with shared amenities. So that's one key way that we can really think about you know, support and actually starting to enable these developments that will curb the tide of that potential displacement out of the district. The other kind of key thing is that nearly half of whānau, and you'll see this later on in other areas as well, have needed to access all forms of different support for their living costs, particularly to pay those critical you know, bills, heating, etc. And it is just a tremendous juggling act, I guess. And so when we address housing, we really do need to add all those different aspects that people are juggling to actually stay living in their homes. So 15% were wanting urgent help with housing, and then another 27% were okay, but they knew someone who was needing urgent help. So we can sort of say that the numbers are kind of somewhere above that in the reach. And that just emphasises how important you know, supporting initiatives like papa kāinga will be to help reduce those numbers. So I'd also like to kind of focus on the vision which the team has, you know, put together, and it's a fantastic one around enabling whānau to thrive and to have a whole lot of options to live close, you know, to their maunga awa, hapua marae, in a kāinga. There's also a number of goals which I will let the group speak to later. What I'd really like to emphasise is that there are a number of solutions that have already been identified. They particularly involve, you know, access to land as well as funding, and a balancing of kind of short-term solutions as well as taking that long-term view. And so it's about putting a whole series of options in place and not just focusing on, necessarily one solution at a time. It needs to be a very multifaceted approach. And then in terms of support, so I think this is a really critical thing that we can all talk about and think about how best to do, and that's recognizing the importance of the environmental and cultural connections to healthy and nurturing homes, really genuine partnerships. Obviously financial support as well, and there are many different ways that could be structured, and that's something that will come out in later conversations as well. And at the core of so much of this as well, there's that trust and that support to really navigate the different options. Infrastructure, particularly around papakainga, is also a key aspect of support that's been discussed that I think it's important to table here. So that was a brief overview, but please do ask questions, and obviously I will give the floor over to Kim, Kirsten and Denise to talk to this after the presentation. Then we were also fortunate to work with Ngāti Toa, and in particular Lisa and Jenny were fantastic, kind of sharing the work that they had been doing actually prior to a lot of this work starting. So they'd done a housing needs assessment, which involved, again, a quite extensive survey and also a series of community hui. And they shared that information and data with us. A lot of it was kind of quite specific to Porirua as an area, and because they'd been working for some time to arrange different deals and land opportunities there as part of a government regeneration program, as a catalyst to many activities. And so from sort of this piece of work perspective, there was data that we could learn from, but not enough that was kapiti specific. So it was really important that we also worked with Ngāti Humia as a key hapu who's based in Paikokariki, and to really understand their story. So there will be quite a bit captured in here from Ngāti Toa, and if Helmut is able to join us, I'm sure he will share some of the fantastic mahi that they're doing there. But I'd just like to focus a bit on, Carl and Miriona's story. And that's really one of going from a situation of thriving and then not being able to keep, your whānau together because of a lack of access to land and considerable issues with funding and having a mortgage that can get beyond you, and how that can snowball into where we are today. But I think what's fantastic about this story is that there are clear ways that we could assist and look at changing the trajectory. So a big thank you to Carl for sharing the story of Miriona, and how her original home was in Queen Elizabeth Park, and when that land became public, essentially there was a different solution, which was to build a new home, which required a loan. And so the key kind of concern there is around having that access to land, and also the funding to kind of deliver a range of options that could essentially bring whānau home that have been displaced from Paikokariki. So that's really the aspiration, and it's really fundamentally, first and foremost, needs to be a land conversation, but then there are also other ways that we can work together as well, but it's really fundamental here that it's a true partnership. And by that, I think the key word we need to focus on is mana enhancing, and how we really define, what that deeply respectful relationship will need to be going forward. So again, I will welcome Carl to really speak to his story afterwards as well, and answer any questions that you have also. So Te Atiawa is very much in action mode, and we've had a number of kōrero with Russell, who is sharing information with us. Through some funding, they were able to get an architect to work with them on kaumātua housing, and then it sort of snowballed into a number of other initiatives. So this has been quite a different approach to some of the other groups. It's really been about kind of capturing and sharing those objectives and aspirations, but also I think in this delivery focused way, being very clear on the guiding kaupapa is quite a significant input into this process from Te Atiawa. So I'll let you all look through this in the full report, but this is sort of captured from some of the work that Te Atiawa have been doing with their architects. And then really the support we need, as with the other groups, it's those mana enhancing partnerships to really catalyse different initiatives. And, in particular, I think there are opportunities to discuss the barriers to some of these more collective living arrangements, and to sort of work through those in partnership as well. That was sort of the key message that we were given by Te Atiawa. So overall, some fantastic information to guide all our interactions, and a really great base to kind of make some decisions from. And so that will be fantastic to talk with you all afterwards. So I just want to shift gears slightly to talk about who participated in the surveys and community kōrero before kind of sharing some of the big themes that have come through the research. So as I mentioned, there were over 1,300 respondents to the survey, which represents over 2% of Kapiti's population, which in the scheme of surveys is a really good turnout. There was both the opportunity to do a digital survey, but also we had paper surveys in the libraries to make sure that they were accessible to different demographics. And we did have the uptake on those, 142 in total. And so really, without needing to read through all these facts and figures, what I wanted to show is that we had a good mixed representation across many different factors. So great that we had a significant Māori contribution to the survey at 14.3%, in addition obviously to all the different work that was done by the iwi partners who ran their own surveys. So if we combine those, it would have obviously been significantly higher. And we also had quite strong representation from other cultural groups as well, new migrants, etc. in particular, which is really valuable to have that information feeding into this process. In terms of locations, it was broadly representative across all of Kapiti, with kind of specific key inputs coming from Ōtaki and Paekokariki being higher than their sort of stats representation, which I think is great because we saw some really critical issues come through in those areas that we've been able to kind of weave in quite strongly throughout our work. In terms of age groups, there wasn't as much of the younger youth representation as sort of matches the population. However, because we did the youth focus groups and did have a strong youth voice coming through, it may be something that we can consider later, but I wouldn't say that they were in any way underrepresented in this work, which is obviously really critical. And then we did have slightly more females than males responding to the survey. Then just in terms of tenure, so you can see that we had slightly higher rates of ownership, but we still had a really strong rental response as well. And also across the different typologies. So 77% is kind of the number of standalone, or percentage, sorry, of standalone in Kapiti, and we had 83.1% responding. So little higher, but still close. And there was still some good voices that came through in kind of that multi-unit space. And again, just that showing you kind of a range of the household types that we were fortunate to get involved, which gave us a good sense of all those different kind of key life stages and how they were facing their housing challenges at the moment. And then for the community korero, all the focus groups events, so we had over 160 people across these different categories. So this just really shows, you know, within each category in yellow, the blue groups are, it was representatives from these groups in particular who were involved, and in many instances, they also kind of snowballed the invitation to other members of the community as well. So it was really through doing quite targeted engagement where we developed a lot of different collateral to reach people is how I think this process has been successful in capturing those stories. And then for the business survey, also there was over 100 businesses who responded, 57 who really answered all the questions, and they were predominantly from the retail sector, although there was a good range, I think, shown in the graph there. And the majority had 3 to 10 employees, which matches with statistics for the area. So there was good representation in that space, which added a really valuable layer to the work. So what were the findings that we sort of brought together from all these different aspects? I'm going to start with kind of, I guess, the key message, which Steve alluded to at the beginning, and that is that housing stress is having a real domino effect in Kapiti, which really is starting to impact on wellbeing in a myriad of different ways. You know, first of all, next to housing, we're seeing this really strong relationship with a sense of place and community connection being fundamental to people's well-being. And where you see housing impacting on this, it's very quick after that. A lot of key issues around food security, job security, etc., start to snowball. Also, before I get into kind of the key themes, it's obviously important to note that there are some spatial differences in need across Kapiti. Generally, views were pretty consistent across the district in terms of all those key issues. We did have some strong rural stories coming through. You know, one example being in Peka, where we had some older residents who had lost their driver's license, and, you know, not being able to have public transport options and not always being able to have family support. The impact on them of not being able to access key services was really significant. And so that relationship between housing, where you're based, and your access to key things is a critical one that we've kept in mind throughout. We also had some fantastic strong voices come through in Paikokariki, and I think what's really fantastic there is that there's a strong kind of resident-led voice who's has longer term aspirations. There's the Paikokariki Housing Trust, who I'd like to give a shout out to, who's doing some fantastic work. And so it was really great to have them involved in this process as well. And then we just wanted to highlight Ōtaki, because there was, you know, as well as significant involvement, some really sort of big issues that are going to be really important to focus on and address. It was the area that has the most severe housing stress. So 28% of renters currently paying more than 50% of rent, of their income in rent. 30% is kind of the threshold for being stress, 30% of your income. And so 50% is that next level of extreme stress. In addition to that, we've got numbers through from Ian and Chris that only 20% of renters in Otaki can affordably pay the median market rent, and only 2% are able to buy a dwelling at the median market sale price. So that's kind of the essence, I guess, of the issues. And from there, we heard a lot of the snowballing effects around displacement, and particularly its effect on children around, their education, and also not only being able to stay in their local schools, but because they're not having to leave straight away to go to, housing elsewhere, when that happens, they're not able to maintain those community connections, stay and play after school, do sports, etc. And so not being able to afford locally is having huge follow-on social effects on a number of children. And that's really the essence of why this issue is so important to address. Some more information there around, lowest median property values, etc. And having other social issues that need to be addressed in terms of, how different support is provided. And so throughout our report, we've woven these stories through, but we'll also be highlighting some of these specific issues. So that will be something to look out for in the final piece of work. So with that in mind, we also have in the report kind of an overlay of what some of the COVID specific responses have been, how that has exacerbated certain social support services. It's also impacted the ability for different groups to deliver. And so that is also kind of framed some of our findings. And so we're quite clear about that in the report. So there are really kind of three key themes that have come through, and they're all interrelated with each other. And so this is sort of a big chunk of the report that you will get to work through. Really, it starts with this idea of housing choice and there not being enough choice, whether it's the price of the house or the type of house it is. I'll dig into a minute in what that means, but that's really impacting on this idea of displacement, pushing people out of their communities because they don't have those options locally, and the follow-on effects of that. And then those combined are really, what really came through so strongly is that without adequate housing, there can be no well-being. And so it's that secure tenure, that secure, not necessarily ownership, but way that you're able to stay in a safe environment, that is sort of the foundation of adequate housing, what that means and how it can help with overall well-being. So just focusing for a minute on housing choice. So this came through time and time again, whether it was in the surveys or the community corridor. And really, I think what was so kind of important about this is that it wasn't just one group, or if we think about housing on a continuum, having market ownership at one end and rental and then state housing. It was across everybody that we were seeing an issue of choice, and I'll talk to that more in a second. So this is just one example of the mismatch that we're seeing, where we know the numbers who live in standalone homes, and through the survey we were able to look at aspirations and who would like to live in a standalone home for their next house. So interestingly, that was sort of a lower percentage than those that currently lived in a standalone house, which begs questions about supporting more medium density solutions, particularly around town centres, etc., which is sort of where people were saying that they wanted to stay close to. And so as well as that house type mismatch, there's also the tenure mismatch, where we can look and through understanding people's incomes and savings, etc., understand that the affordability of the sort of standard ownership model, there was only 30% who could actually afford the lower quartile house price, 13% who could afford the average house price, and 7% who could afford the average price for a standalone house. So you can really compare that 7% being able to afford with the 71% who aspire to own. And this is the mismatches that we are really capturing through this process. And I think the other kind of key thing here, because it's so linked to incomes, is obviously to highlight that the required household income to not be stressed and not spending more than 30% of your income on housing. To purchase at that lower quartile house price was 120,000, and it goes up to 209,000 to purchase the average standalone house. So those are some really sobering numbers for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about housing choices and how we support a greater diversity. The survey data also showed, aside from the strong desire to own, that as I mentioned, 1 in 10 don't have the ability to afford it. But the bigger, or an extra layer to this issue, is that even those that can afford it may not be able to find it. And that's because, when I mentioned before that 30% of people could afford that lower quartile house price, there's actually only 20% of that stock available in Kapiti. So you can see very quickly the difference in those two figures is what's creating this displacement to people having to move outside of the area because what they can afford and what they want to live in are not available locally. That's really kind of the essence of choice, and we'll go into more detail in the report about different aspects of that as well. The second theme that I just wanted to highlight for you all today is around this idea of, that housing issues are pushing people out of their communities. And there are a whole lot of different aspects that are drawn together in this, and these are just some key pieces of information I wanted to highlight, which are that in many ways sort of created a perfect storm in Kapiti for this to occur, with roading improvements and rail services, making it easier to live in Kapiti while working in higher income areas like Wellington. We're seeing, anecdotal evidence that the housing markets are being influenced by the ability of these groups to pay. And there was also a lot of commentary that came through in the community sessions around COVID also having an impact here, with people wanting to return to Kapiti or move to Kapiti because living costs were lower. It was seen as a really, safe, fantastic environment to be if you didn't have to be in the office and you could work from home. So these factors were really coming together and impacting on the availability of housing, which in turn was impacting on the price. So woven throughout our report some really important stories that we heard, and we thought one of the best ways to do that was to really quote people. So you'll see a number of these come through, but I just wanted to highlight a couple today. And that was really about the relationship between the availability of this housing and those critical support networks and how valuable they are to people. And also the kind of other key thing that came through so strongly was the intergenerational impacts that this is having, and how at the end of the day, that the way that it affects children is what we need to be so cognizant of in all our kind of decision making. So another thing that we've done to sort of bring all these different pieces of information together is to create personas, stories about people where, you know, we've heard their story, whether it be directly from them or from a social service provider that they're working with, anyone that's been involved in those community sessions. And in some instances, it was also through the stories that people wrote and the open-ended questions that we had in the survey. And so essentially for a number of the different parts of the report where we focus on key groups, we explain the story, you know, and in this instance, I just thought I'd share with you the Johnson whānau, that all too familiar story of a young Māori family in Ōtaki, you know, who are just doing their best to have a secure home to live in, but they're facing being forced to move in order to pay less per week in rent. That's meaning that, you know, mum has to take on a new night job, dad has to keep his job in Wellington, you know, he needs to sleep in the car during the week because of the difference in the cost, you know, compounded by the rising cost of petrol, but he needs that salary base to pay rent. And then you have all the follow-on effects on the kids of, you know, not having that same support network. And it also is bringing in the grandparents who are now, you know, needing to do a lot more care. And so this story that we highlight, we also really think about what could be done next and draw together a lot of different solutions that were also, you know, proposed through the work or have come through some of the other analysis. And so you'll see in the full report that there's, for every group, I think the key thing is that there's a range of options. So there's never a silver bullet solution, and it's never about just doing one thing. It's always about supporting that diversity of approaches. So we look at kind of, you know, broader range of long-term rentals, papakainga, as I mentioned, being a fantastic option in that area, and also kind of, you know, shared equity schemes and working with community housing providers, etc. So I hope that this is a great way that we can draw together everything from the stories and the data to focus on those key issues. So it'll be great, you know, to get your feedback on this once you see the full report as well. And then the third theme is that, you know, when it all comes together without adequate housing, there can be no well-being. And this is where we asked a number of questions around the trade-offs that people are starting to make because of their rising living costs and needing to pay rent. What were these trade-offs? And what we really found is that 1 in 5 people borrowed money from whānau, family and friends, to help them pay their housing costs. 1 in 5 were also stated that they were unable to heat or cool their home as much as they felt they needed to because they were making those trade-off choices because of the cost. 1 in 5 also indicated they skipped a meal or changed their eating habits, you know, because money had been tight. They were unable to buy things that they needed, you know, whether it was home appliances or school supplies, everyday needs. And 1 in 5 had also delayed payments for essential bills, you know, power, water, internet. So that really gives you a picture of what people said, and this was irrespective of, you know, their current tenure type, whether they were renting or owning. It was both. And then we also had 3 in 10 people who delayed visiting a medical practitioner And that could be a combination of COVID, but we specifically framed the question around relating to housing costs. So I think it's still a significant one to consider in all of this. And 3 in 10 were also unable to pay for recreational activities, which, you know, can be so important to our everyday well-being as well. You know, sports memberships, the ability to actually go on an outing with your family. So these trade-offs are really how we can start to understand the relationship between housing and all the other aspects of the system. The other kind of idea that I just wanted to highlight in today's session was around, you know, how sustainable is it for people to continue living like this? If you look at this graph, what this really shows is that essentially if you're sort of earning anywhere up to 90,000, the chances of you having to make all these different decisions, whether it's working multiple jobs, you know, using your savings, using a food bank, getting financial support from different methods. If you're under that 90,000 threshold for a family, which we know many are, you're likely to be doing a whole myriad of these things. And the big one is that throughout, you can see the yellow, people are using their savings to supplement their living costs at the moment. This obviously makes it very difficult to get ahead. And it's also something that we really have to kind of question. How can we create a system where that's not so prevalent as we're seeing in this data? And just on the right-hand side, I put for kind of comparison, the median pay ranges for some key roles. So you can start to see that, you know, if you had a primary school teacher and a chef, you know, they'd just be in the middle of that continuum. If your primary teacher was a solo parent, you can see they'd be much further down and indicatively making a huge number of different choices to try and support their living costs. Now, the other kind of key aspect to this that we brought through is across both the survey, where we had an open-ended question asking people, you know, what would it mean to thrive and live well in Kapiti? And we did the same process through the community corridor. And when we sort of themed that all together, you could see that there was sort of over, you know, 330 discussions about sense of community being at the core of thriving and living well, you know, through to over 120 for accessing to services and infrastructure, amenities, town centres, etc. And so I think this hopefully visually captures a good picture of the key ways that people are thinking about thriving and living well. And so much of it is interrelated. The other kind of key thing that we've done as part of this research, as well as these sort of bringing together these high level themes, you know, looking at people's stories, but also many of the numbers that sit behind them, is also to arrange that information by key groups so that it's really accessible to kind of look at the specific aspects of or issues that these groups are kind of considering. So I'm just going to give 2 examples today, and all these aspects will be covered in the full piece of work. So one that I wanted to start with was our older residents, 65 plus. It was really interesting that there was a strong desire expressed by many groups that they often were considering or thinking that in the future they would want to consider moving, but only if they could stay in their local neighbourhood. And the biggest kind of deterrent of that was that they didn't feel they had options where they could, you know, downsize or have a much more intergenerational way of living, because it was so critical that they were close to family and friends. And so this really raises questions around how we actually support those smaller dwellings in our existing communities so that people can really age in place, you know, get older alongside their friends and family and still feel supported. So we also kind of capture a number of the key points in the community kōrero for each of the groups. So here you can kind of see that key ideas that came through were, you know, older people also having to support younger members of their family. So there's that, you know, relationship between key groups, and the fact that because this is a system-wide issue, naturally it's affecting groups, you know, in interconnected ways as well. And that came through really strongly. It was also about accessing services being really important, you know, and thinking about all the different ways that older residents could stay connected. The other thing that we were seeing is a growing sort of voice of, within this group, people who may not have the savings that all the calculations in terms of living off your pension are based on. And so there was this real concern about the next 5-10 years, and just that reliance on savings being a bit of a ticking time bomb in terms of housing options. And so here we hear the story of Jude and Jim, two long-standing Kapiti residents. They have had a great time living in Kapiti over the years, and they really want to help their family. There's, you know, some intergenerational distress that's been created by these rising housing costs. They have 3 kids who have kids. They also want to stay in Kapiti, and while, you know, they have good jobs, many of them are putting together savings, it's just not enough. And so in that third column, we kind of crunch some of the numbers to help us tell this story around the choice that they made to move into a retirement village after selling their house at the median price. And then once they kind of calculated pretty basic living costs, they split the remaining money between their children. And they had between sort of 6 and 57% less than they needed for the lower quartile house price. And so in terms of what could be done next, we look at kind of greater options for these two, increasing provisions for intergenerational housing, creating more smaller houses and communities, as I mentioned, you know, and broader options for their children as well. Being a critical part of this solution is actually considering, you know, how to help their children as well. The other kind of key group that I just wanted to highlight today, although I'm happy to talk about any of them afterwards in question time, was owners and renters, because we've been seeing a significant difference between owners and renters in terms of their sort of overall satisfaction with their dwellings, but we're seeing similar trade-offs being made with all those daily life expenses. So I wanted to highlight that while we are very aware in the data of the issues that are facing renters, I think there's a lot more emerging about than we previously had data on, about those owners who are under stress in their dwellings. And that's why when we think about these housing issues, we can't just say, well, X portion of residents in Kapiti own their home, therefore we can say that they're sorted. What we really got through from a lot of the community sessions, but also quite strongly in the survey, was that there's a big group of owners who are teetering in many ways, and they will need support in future years unless we look to kind of address some of these some of these sort of system-wide issues. The other kind of key thing was, up until really asking people, there wasn't a lot of data on how many people might want to move if they could, and how many people kind of didn't feel that they were able to. And so this kind of quote from someone, while our houses may be worth a lot, it's monopoly money, as to buy something else is almost impossible. And we heard quite a lot of stories from families in particular who didn't feel that they were in the right size house. Maybe they are a family with, 3 children, they're in a 2-bed. They'd love to be able to take that leap up to a bigger home, but they're very much trapped where they are. So while it may appear as though they are homeowners, there's other embedded issues within that. And so that's something that I think came through quite strongly in the research. And that at all times kind of needs to be balanced with the lack of affordability and security that we're seeing for renters. So, one sort of that really hit me was that 2 out of 3 can no longer affordably pay the median market rent in Kapiti. And so when we think back to all those trade-offs that people are making, you can understand why, but you can also understand that 2 and 3 number won't be going down anytime soon unless we look at all these different options. The other kind of key aspect that I just wanted to highlight for everybody that we've sort of been digging into through the community sessions where we specifically spoke to different service providers, and Steve did a fantastic job of engaging a broad number of different groups, different types of wraparound services for people, as well as government agencies. And so we've really tried to summarise some of their key views, both of their own work and what they're trying to do, and also the key groups that they're serving. So really some key kind of observations. This is very much just a summary here, but what came through so strongly was how needs are becoming increasingly complex. And so people are requiring multiple wraparound services. And because of that lack often of integration across different government departments, at the end of the day, the message that came through from these groups was that those key people who are needing help are not always getting it in a timely way. And because housing stress has all these follow-on effects, we heard so many stories where an issue could have been solved if there was secure housing available, but it had snowballed as a result. So for example, some of the persona stories that we have embedded in include Dave, who was in prison for a long time and finally able to reintegrate, but there was no housing available, and in the end he was advised to stay in prison at a cost of 170k. And we looked at what it would have cost if there was a 2-bed available so that his kids could also come and stay. And if we had given him the benefit to support him through the next, transition phase in his life. And those costs were significantly lower, already over $80,000 lower than keeping him in prison. So that kind of illustrates the stories that came through from a lot of the service providers around the solutions that they're finding are not always necessarily optimal for the people that they're trying to serve, but they're also not optimal for the system overall in terms of efficiency or cost. And so putting people first can also have a whole lot of other positive follow-on benefits. And I think that what we heard from everybody kind of captures that really well, and it emphasizes this need for collaboration that came through so strongly from people. Just another key thing I will mention too is a number of times it also came through in those sessions around, access to key services like GPs, for example, being an issue. It's a nationwide issue, but it's also something that came through strongly in Kapiti. So I guess that's where these housing system conversations need to come through. I also just wanted to highlight some key observations that came through from the business survey. They fit into all different aspects, but we also kind of included them in this section as well. And that was, you can just see, 63.8% agree that their staff are struggling to pay their household costs, and they don't feel that they're able to increase their pay to assist with this. 48% are struggling to attract and retain staff due to housing costs. 67% thought that the housing market was causing stress for their workers. 50% felt that staff were struggling to pay their housing related costs, and that was causing them to work more hours or work more than one job to cover these costs. And so you could see that idea embedded in one of those personas with the Johnson whānau, and around how that sort of needing to do all these extra hours, etc., was having a snowball effect on families. So it really came through in the business survey as well. Right now, I'm just being notified that the Mayor may want to say something. I don't have my picture of you all on the screen at the moment.
Only when you're ready to take
you wanted to add in? No,
only when you're ready to take questions.
Okay, we're not far away. I'm on the homeward stretch, I promise. So the other kind of where we end this piece of work, and it's really where the housing strategy and other pieces of work within council work streams will pick up on afterwards. So where we end it is really hearing participant responses about those next step solutions. And so there were sort of three key categories we felt came through when we looked at everyone's responses. And we go into more detail into each of these in the report. So that was around needing the right housing in the right places. And really that idea that housing options need to be as diverse as people. The next key idea that people put forward was that we need coordination across agencies. So the idea that there was a one-stop shop for people that, was really people-centred, that created a system whereby the government agencies had to work together better. Other ideas that came through there were around like more emphasis on having assistance with navigating that system. But I think the stories about navigating the system we have were always counterbalanced if not superseded by conversations about actually needing to address the system that we have as well. And then the physical house and the wraparound services required to make solutions last were both essential. So that was the other key idea that people put forward and shared, and they shared detail within this as well, around how just providing houses was only part of the solution, and to enable them to be long-term, sustainable solutions for people, there needed to be additional support to help them stay in those solutions. And combined, this really came through that change was needed across the whole system. And that was really the key message that came across in nearly every focus group. So many of the community responses that we had in the survey. So it's really fitting that we end on that note, that the time for change is now. And we really thought it could be summed up with this idea that for a long time, we've been saying it could be worse. And we heard from a lot of owners in the surveys who's in many ways, indicated that they didn't want to express that they were having trouble because they knew of so many other people who were having more trouble than they were. But it really got us, thinking about these these different stories we were hearing and saying, you know, at what point do we stop saying it could be worse and start saying it's bad enough? And so this needs assessment has really revealed that for many, the time for change is now, but fundamentally that a coordinated response across the whole housing system will be essential to bring about this change. And that's what will be critical for the future of Kapiti. So thank you everyone for bearing with me. I'm conscious that there is so much more depth I could have shared, but I hope that that was a really good taster of what is within this piece of work, and also it kind of explained how it's been drawn together to really highlight the breadth and depth of the issues and how it's affecting all different groups across, you know, our housing spectrum. So I thought it might be good if I began by just giving the floor to everyone to ask questions about iwi partners so that they can really talk to their stories personally to begin with. And then after that, we can have a quick break and we'll come back and you can ask us any questions about the rest of what was presented as well. So Kirsten, what's the process for unmuting people?
Natalie, it's, if you just let me know who you want to speak, I can go through and unmute them.
Oh, great. Well, we've got Kirsten Hapita here. We've got Kim. Who else? I said, I've got Denise.
To ask Kirsten to unmute, so perhaps you could start with Kirsten.
Okay, great. Have we got Carl here as well? Just hopefully you can all unmute yourselves so that you can share some stories. And so if anyone would like to raise their hand and ask any questions, feel free. Otherwise, I will pass over to Kirsten to add some keywords for us.
I think it'd be better to hear from the Manawhenua before you open it up to questions.
Yeah, perfect. Over to you, Kirsten.
Oh, kia ora. I'm actually still digesting the information that you shared with us, Natalie. I mean, we do have some information prepared that we can add to what was shared today, if people would like to hear that. But I wondered if, when is the break scheduled for? It might be good if we get an opportunity to, digest what was said before we start talking and doing the question answer session, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Natasha, shall we just move our break forward so people can get a cup of tea, they can think about the flood of things and process, and then we can come back and have a really great Q&A session.
Yep, that sounds perfect. Thank you.
How much time would you like us to take, Natasha?
I would suggest maybe 15 minutes if people want to have a bit of a look through the material and digest stuff, as well as get a quick break and a cuppa.
I'm seeing some nods, so let's do that. We'll take 15 minutes and be back just before 11:05.